My subject this morning is going to be encourage yourself in the Lord, for we surely shall recover it all. Encourage yourself in the Lord, for we surely recover it all. The story begins here it backs up just a few chapters to chapter 27, and it says that, and David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day in the hand of Saul, that there is nothing better for me than I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines, and Saul shall despair of me to seek me anymore. In any case of Israel, so shall I escape out of the hand of his hand. So David gets up with his 600 men, with their children and wives, and they go to Achish, who is the king of Gath. David moves in with Achish at Gath. He and his men with their wives and children. The Bible says that Saul received news that David had fled to Gath, and Saul looked no longer or no more for him. David tells Achish, if I have now found grace in your eyes, give me a place in thy town, a town in thy country, that I may live there, for why should your servant live in a royal city with you? Then Achish gives him Ziklag that day. And David lived in the country of the Philistines a year and 4 months. So that's how David gets to Ziklag. David should have not been in Ziklag, because God's word was clear that the children of Israel were not to mix with the surrounding nations. Over and over again, the warning was given, and every time somebody tried it, disaster was the result. David knew all this, and he still did it anyway. But that shows us that God is merciful even when we fall short in doing what he says to do. We also must remember that God had promised David that he will be the next king of Israel. That means that Saul would never, ever be able to kill him, no matter how hard he tried. So what that means for us today is that God has promised, whatever God has promised to us, if we remain in his will, it shall come to pass, no matter how bleak or how far outreach it seems. If he promised it, he will do just what he said he would do. Now, in 1 Samuel, the 29th chapter, Saul was worried about the Philistine army. David and his men were joining it. Every man in Philistine who could fight had to join the army. David had been living in the Philistines since he fled from Saul. Philistine consisted of 5 different towns. Each town had 5 different kings, or they all had their own king, who had the authority over that town and the country around it. When the nation went to war, each king had to bring all their men from that region into the battle. David and his men lived in the region of King Achish of Gath, where he ruled. Achish had seen that David was skilled, loyal, and a strong soldier. In fact, Achish trusted David so much that he wanted David to be his personal bodyguard. Although Achish had absolute rule over his region, his decision about the Philistine army needed to be supported by the other rulers. It surprised the Philistine rulers very much to see men from Israel amongst soldiers amongst Achish's soldiers. Achish had told the rulers that they could trust David, for David was an army commander from Israel who had become the enemy of Saul. When David escaped from Saul, he came to Gath, and Achish has watched David carefully and for more than 1 year. I know I'm taking a little long, y'all. I'm going to get there. David had been loyal to Achish. Achish believed that David had now made the people of Israel his enemies. Achish's opinion about David was very wrong. David had been loyal to Achish, but David was not, in fact, against Israel. David continued to support and to protect Israel people even when he was living in Philistine. Although Saul had often tried to kill David, David refused to attack Saul. David still considered Saul to be the king whom God has anointed and appointed to rule Israel. So King Achish of Gath had ordered David and his men to join the Philistine army. When they had marched for 3 days, they reached the army camp. But God intervenes in a way to release David from his oath to support the Philistines against the Israelites. I can imagine that David and his men were somewhat in a bind because they couldn't refuse to go with Achish, yet their desire would be to fight with the Israelites. Nevertheless, the ruler of the Philistines told Achish why they didn't want to allow David to join their army. They agreed with many of the things that Achish said about David, but David couldn't be trusted. They even believed that David was loyal to Achish, and it seemed clear to them that David and Saul were now enemies. However, Philistine rulers still considered it too dangerous to have David in their army. Even in Philistine, David's name was well known. They knew him from the popular song that the women in Israel sang. Saul had slain his 1,000, and David his 10,000. That song spread across the whole region, and it praised David as a great army commander. That song had also confused Achish's servants so much that they believed that David was Israel's king. They wondered if David joined the Philistine army that he might use his position inside the camp for his own advantage, which means that when they're in there fighting, the Israelites would be on one side and the Philistines would be in the middle, and David would attack them from the rear. So David is released by the Philistine army. So we're making it closer to our text this morning. David he leaves and he goes back without putting up a fight. I believe that he was relieved in some kind of way because he really didn't want to fight against the people, his own people. And David behaved like this because he respected God and did not want to gain power by any schemes. David wanted God to bring about God's plan for David's life. So David tried to deal with everybody in a proper, loyal, and honorable way. As a holy man, David was very careful David was very careful only to speak the truth. He did not tell Achish that he wanted to fight against Saul or Israel. That would be untrue. Instead, David said that he would fight against Achish's enemies, and that was true. In fact, as soon as David returned home, he had to do that. He led his men into attack against a large group of robbers, the Amalekites, who had attacked the Philistine, and that included Ziklag. God did not want David to fight against Saul or against Israel. Sometimes, as the children of God, he gives us a way out of certain situations, and we refuse to obey him and take that way out. The situation doesn't look very good for David. His group was somewhat just humiliated by the Philistine army leaders, whom they were going to join against the Israelites as they were going into battle. They were somewhat rejected. So while David and his men were gone, the Amalekites came and burned Ziklag. And they took all the women and children captive. Even David's wives were taken. There's a touch of God poetic justice in this, because David had brought this exact calamity on other cities. That's what 1 Samuel 21:27 says. During his time among the Philistines, David made his living as a bandit, robbed cities. Whenever David attacked the land, he left neither men nor women alive.